So welcome everyone, especially to the folks whose first time it is here. I remember coming here for the first time when it was in a different location about 20 years ago after I moved to New York City, and here I am still coming. So welcome to the launch for Pop Empire's Transnational and Diasporic Flows of India and Korea. The beautiful, beautiful cover. It's edited by Heijin Lee, Monika Mehta, and Robert Jisong Koo. Monika isn't here with us, so I'm filling in as a resident South Asian American. But we have Heijin and Robert. So I'm just going to do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll move to a brief overview of the book by me, and then we'll talk about our own connections either to Bollywood, to K-pop, the Korean wave, or both. And I'm going to insist that after the introductions that we all come up and sit down. Maybe? Yeah? Good. So I had written very long, impressive introductions to Robert and Heijin, but I was told by Robert to keep it short. Okay. So Robert Koo is an associate professor of Asian and Asian American Studies at Binghamton University at the State University of New York. His research interests include Asian American studies, food studies, and studies of Korean popular culture. And he's published numerous books. You can look him up. Heijin Lee is an assistant professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, New York University. Her research explores the imperial routes of culture and media. And she's also the author or co-author of multiple books. My name is Linta Varghese. I'm an assistant professor at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, where I teach Asian and Asian American studies. And my interests don't really intersect with pop culture. I do gender and labor and finance. But I was asked to moderate this, and I happily and reluctantly agreed because of the topic matter and also because of who the editors are. So should we all come up here before I talk?
Hello.
Oh, you have a
Yes, should we just sit here and like this?
Well, just
this
why
will
not?
work.
I felt lonely just standing up by myself in very bright lights. So Robert initially asked me to participate and then sent me a link to the information of the book. And my first reaction was yeah, it makes sense. There are these two nations, India and Korea, that have increasingly had their cultural products consumed, larger and larger audiences consume them. But I think what the editors, what you guys did was actually more than this. The book, to use an old post-colonial studies phrase, it kind of provincializes Hollywood, right? By placing Bollywood and the Korean wave in relation to each other, and not just taking them as discrete, distinct things that circulate separately, independent of each other. But I think the brilliance of the book is that it looks at how these two cultural forms kind of speak to each other, right? And in doing so, in that method, I thought it was a great way to show how, what can happen and what we can see when we take things that we often think of as being so different and put them together and see what emerges from that. Can I borrow your book, Robert?
Yeah.
Thanks. I have my copy too in my bag. So one of the other things that I just wanted to highlight about what I think your book does, it's talking about culture, and I think Asian populations and Asian nations are often just only, at least in the United States, read mainly through culture. But I think that by putting India and Korea side by side, vis-a-vis culture, you kind of see extreme difference. But then when you put them side by side through culture and structure, you see the ways that they actually share a lot of commonalities. So I'm just going to read a couple of passages on page 3. And I promise at some point you'll watch videos, Bollywood videos and K-pop videos too. Okay. At first glance, and this is from the book, I'm just going to read 2 passages just to give us a sense of how the method of the book works, right? With the larger, I thought was kind of like a larger outcome of the book. At first glance, India and Korea appear to have little in common. Most conspicuously, the 2 countries are separated by thousands of miles. The gulf between the 2 is not merely geographic, however, but can be surmised more significantly as fundamentally cultural. They have no obvious architectural, musical, sartorial, or linguistic consanguinity or any other sort of interconnection, or so it seems. Gastronomically speaking, the 2 countries appear to be entirely alien to one another, despite the preponderance of New World capsicum in both cuisines, or so it seems. Moreover, one would be hard-pressed to identify any well-chronicled historical overlap that might necessitate the 2 nations becoming a topic of a shared conversation. Again, so it seems. Once the seemingly counterintuitive work of juxtaposing India with Korea is initiated, on a closer inspection, it is abundantly clear that the 2 nations do in fact share numerous historical attributes that have been the defining features of the 20th century. In sum, both are no strangers to the turmoil of colonialism, independence, war, partition, nationhood, post-coloniality, modernity, democracy, transnationalism, diaspora, and neoliberalism. Indeed, in this regard, the parallels are almost uncanny. So I'll stop there, but I think, just to give you a sense of what the book is, it's definitely about, these like fun pop culture forms that circulate and like so pleasurable to consume. But as with, the ideal academic book on pop culture, it goes deeper than that too. So I was asked to give like a summary of the book. I'll be very brief. Okay. Pop Empires is able to dive deeply into Bollywood and the Korean waves, at times together and at times apart. So I just want to go over just kind of like the 4 major themes that the book is organized around. I'm not going to cover everything. You should buy it, or if you can't buy it, ask your library to purchase it. Right, so it's like available to everyone. So one major concern of the book is the way that both Bollywood and the Korean wave allows producers, fans, and stars to queer various spaces, including the products themselves. And queering in this instance is both around sexuality, and then also the ways that reformulation of norms can happen through these cultural products. This includes how Korean idols act as role models for Thai tomboys to create new gender and social norms, the affective labor of K-pop fandom in Mexico as acts of social change, and the queer performances of Bollywood, led by white-collar class workers that disrupt the gendered norms that are transmitted through many Bollywood productions. Pop Empires also takes stardom as a site of inquiry, which is great because there were like 2 people in there who I like as stars, so it felt really cool. Heijin actually has a piece about Psy, and this is actually something I remember, like when he would be on like Good Morning America or something. He would talk about Gangnam Style and the dance, and then he had this like very anti-U.S. military stance, and I mean, it seemed like it came out of nowhere, right, to the American viewer, but I'm assuming that it's like a much longer history that he has. And there's a section of the book that I really love it's about crossover, that pushes the idea of crossover, and one of the articles I just want to lift up a little bit is about these dance studios and choreographers in London who have made Bollywood dancing kind of like a legitimate dance form. I grew up in the Indian diaspora in Houston, Texas, and we were all sent, or like many of us girls were sent to study like classical Indian dancing, because that was like that is what you did to keep your culture alive. And I think it's kind of cool that Bollywood dance has shaped up to be seen as a legitimate form, which it is. And then finally, any contemporary examination of global cultural forms would have to look at the ways that new media and the digital mediate and expand the market. I'm going to highlight one of the 3 articles in this section, which actually looks at a really old form. And this article ends book 2. And this is painted billboards in Korea and India. And I didn't know that Korea had this tradition too. And I miss seeing them in India, actually, as I've gotten older. The article looks at them as really important expressions of local culture. And I really like that they ended this book kind of looking backwards and not forwards necessarily. I was asked to talk about my own personal connection with Bollywood. And as I confessed before the event started to Robert and Heijin, it's complicated, like many relationships that one might have, right? To something that you kind of love, but then you're also like want to keep a distance. One of the things I appreciate about the book and the editors is their very candid descriptions of this project and these cultural forms as both very personal to them, right? Things that you consume and you enjoy. That have been in your life since childhood, in addition to looking at it in a scholarly manner. But, my family is from Kerala, India, in the south. Yeah, I was like, I bet there's going to be Malayali in the audience. And so it's, the dominant language is Malayalam. We migrated here in the 70s, so a while ago, and I think one of the things that the question about my own relationship to Bollywood made me think about is just how that in the diaspora, at least, like the moment when the era of migration really shapes your relationship to these forms. And so, the language in my home, the language of the movies that we saw, the music that we heard was all Malayalam, and then of course English. And my parents, they're in India right now, and I was talking to them about their connection to Bollywood, and they're both like, yeah, we lived in Delhi, we lived in Bombay, right? Like they lived for a long time in the seat of Bollywood, but they never cared for Bollywood movies. And I think there is something about region and the limits of Bollywood to contain kind of region in the diaspora. That's a question for me that this brings up. I really came to Bollywood through like friends. I went with some family friends when I was a tween to go see Amitabh Bachchan perform live in like the big stadium in Houston. And I know he's like an old man right now, right? But when I was 12, it was just amazing to me. And since this time, I've been kind of in and out of consuming Bollywood. I had to learn Hindi to get my doctorate, like as part of my graduate training. So I used to watch Bollywood to just keep up with my Hindi proficiency, and now I've been told that it's like a new era in Bollywood, so I should check it out. So I binge watched Made in Heaven. I don't know if that really counts as Bollywood, but has anyone seen that series on Netflix? Check it out. It's amazing. I have a 7-year-old child, and I binge watched it, which I think says a lot about my priorities once when I saw it. When I saw the first episode. So I'll end there. I don't want to take up too much time, but I do think that there's a lot of different ways that like a South Asian could have filled in like as a representative of Bollywood, and I'm kind of filling in as someone with the kind of a love-hate relationship to it. I do think that in the diaspora it becomes very dominant, and sometimes can leave little space. But I say this at the same time that this might date me. I remember going to Bollywood disco with, which DJ Rika used to put on in the 2000s, and to Sholay parties and Salga parties. So it is both kind of a soundtrack of my life, but then I've often turned it off for long stretches of time too. Should I show the video? Yeah. So Robert asked me to pick two videos, and I picked 3. I'm sorry. But we'll just watch clips of them, but I don't know how to. You want to set up the first one? Sure. So the first one, I have no idea where to click or what to do. Right, I'm going to turn this way and look. Oh, does anyone know what this is? Who said yes? What is it? It's Umrah Jahan. Yeah, and when Robert asked me to pick 3 videos that I'd like to show, the first video, because my intro to Bollywood was really in the early 80s, and I was like, what's the first kind of video or song I remember? And it was Aap Jaise Koi from Kurbani, and I watched it, and then I was like, Zinat Aman can't dance, right, to save her life, so I'm not going to show that video. But then I came to Umrah Jahan, and I was like, oh, this is actually a good example of kind of the complicatedness of Bollywood and region, because the star that's in it is South Indian, and she's a classically trained dancer, so I was like the anti-Zenith. But I think it shows both its ability, and there are a couple there's an article in the book about Bollywood's engagement with the regional, which includes actors and actresses. I also just think it's kind of all the kind of the lushness of the Mughal eras. It's nice to see. Sound. I also like to think I have a personal connection with Rekha, because my dance teacher in Houston studied with her when she was being trained as a child. So I'm like, oh, we're the same lineage. Not true at all. I'm probably more like Zenith. So I think, did I turn this off? So then I, my latest return to Bollywood, in our on-again, off-again relationship, people kept telling me to watch Zoya Akhtar films. And so my second choice, I thought I would just show the original, I guess, of this song, Gully Boy. But also it's so aesthetically different than what I showed, and it's 40 years apart too. So.
Mic check, बोले क्या बोल रहे ले काली बॉय क्या बोल रहे एमसी शेर अरे अपन कुछ करते ना यार अपने पब्लिक के लिए करते ना अब बड़े लोग के लिए भाई अपने 500 लोग के लिए ओ एक नंबर तुम किधर हो तुम अभी बॉम्बे 17 में बात तुम किधर हो 5-9 तेरे तेरे शूटरों का खास मेरे गली में अब पूरे शहर की आवाज मेरे गली में प्रेया किया नमाज मेरे गली में माँ पे गाली तो चमाट मेरे गली में अब पुलिस आई लगी वाट मेरे गली में एक नंबर सारी बात मेरे गली में अच्छा वो निकली तेरे गली से पर वो मेरे गली में मेरे गली में गली 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 में मेरे गली में गली 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 में और तेरे शूटरों का खास मेरे गली में अब पूरे शहर की आवाज मेरे गली में
Yeah, there's one more. I think they're out of order. Robert's telling me to wrap up. That's a Bollywood version of an independent song, and I think it's also like a good example of just kind of the multiple forms that both Bollywood and the Korean wave are able to kind of assimilate into their production.
Hi. So first I just want to say thank you, all of you, for coming to this launch. If you've ever published a book, you know these things take forever. So this is a multi-year labor of love that we're finally sort of releasing into the world, and that all of you made time to celebrate it with us is very meaningful. I also want to thank the Asian American Writers Workshop for hosting us. This is such a space filled with history. It, for me, is really meaningful that we can do this here. And thank you, Linta. I mean, to just jump in and moderate and give that amazing personal and sort of historical overview is a lot of labor that you've done for us, and I really appreciate it. So just a couple things that we wanted to touch on. In the book, we write a little bit about how we came to this, right? Because this is an academic book, but it's very personal to all three of us co-editors. So I thought I would just read a couple paragraphs about my journey to studying pop culture and Hallyu, which, you know, by the way, to any students in the room, you know, I would tell my professors I'm going to study, actually my main research interest is beauty. And so I would say, you know, I'm going to study beauty and pop culture, and they would be like, what? That's not an appropriate topic of study. And I, you know, to anyone who's interested in studying pop culture, beauty, or the things that give us pleasure, I hope that you can read this book and take away from this program, right, the idea that the pleasurable is ultimately the most political, right? Because it holds all of our hopes and dreams and what we like and what we don't like. And for me, studying pop culture is a way to trace, you know, exactly the politics behind all the sort of nuggets that are the foundation of my life, right? The everydayness of my life. So I'm going to read a little bit from this, and then we're going to watch some music videos. So Heijin's introduction, that would be me, to and perhaps fondest memories of Korean pop culture was through family. Although instead of films, it involved television serial dramas produced in Korea, aka the K-drama. In the 80s and 90s, K-dramas were one of the primary and most pleasurable ways in which her family, like other diasporic Koreans, stayed connected to and kept up with Korea. Right, so back then there was no internet, right? There's no social media. There was very expensive long-distance phone calls, and also those airmail envelopes that would come, you know, every once in a while. So this was really a ritual to stay Korean, right, for lack of a better way to say it. I remember sitting with my parents on Friday evenings to watch whichever drama or variety show aired on the single Korean channel that was available on cable television. Later, when I could drive, I would run errands to the nearest Korean grocery store, which stocked not only jars of kimchi and other essential Korean kitchen staples, but also shelf after shelf of VHS cassette tapes with Korean programming. I would bring home the latest dramas in stacks of 10 or 15. 20 always seemed just a little too much, you know, like a little too indulgent. And that would be 10 or 15 VHS tapes at $1 a pop in black plastic bags. Does anyone remember this, right? You would come home with these black plastic bags, you know, ready for the weekend, right? It was the original binge watching. The effortless and almost immediate ways in which we access digitalized cultural products today over the internet leaves little or no trace of the emotional affect of viewership. Back then, however, the bulky VHS tapes and flimsy plastic bags were tactile and concrete evidence of my family's hunger for some sort of connectedness to Korea. They were material affirmation of my family's addiction to the binge watching of K-dramas and an indisputable reminder of the countless hours that we would spend getting caught up on a particularly popular drama that had only days ago aired in Korea. Despite the temporal delay and spatial distance, thanks to the ritual of VHS K-drama rentals, my family stayed connected to family and friends in Korea. And perhaps more importantly, we shared in the experience of being a part of the Korean diaspora, of what it means to be Korean in the US. And so I go on to write about watching 모래시계, which is Sand Glass, one of the most sort of famous Korean dramas, and how this was one of the first ones that I binge watched with my family, but it was also a historical drama. And it included some events that happened in the diaspora in LA. And for the first time, I realized that my history in the diaspora was actually connected to the history in Korea. And it was through the drama that I actually learned about Korean history, because I certainly didn't learn about it in my American public school. And, you know, Korean families are not the best about sharing, right, about historical memory. So, you know, all of this is to say that there is so much meaning in the pop culture forms that we consume. And there's so much of the personal, right, family, kinship, that happens through these acts. Now, of course, everything's available on Netflix. You know, my students can't imagine a time when we had to work so hard just to watch something. But the alternative to that, right, is, you know, what the other thing I write about in the book is that it was through Netflix that I was able to watch some of my first Bollywood films. And it was my students who introduced me to them. And so in this way, this sort of like global sharing of cultural form is really amazing and something that we touch on in the book. The other 2 points that I wanted to make have to do with these music videos that I'll share now. So I was going to share Psy's Gangnam Style, but no one wants to see that again, right? You all saw it so many times in 2012 that, you know, you're like, do we have to see it again? But, so instead I decided to show Psy performing with MC Hammer at the American Music Awards. Some of you may have missed this. You will thank me later for showing this to you.
Hammer time. Open Gangnam Style.
I love his face.
Gangnam Style. Open Gangnam Style.
So I, first of all, love the audience that they choose to show. The two Asians, right? They're like, look, the Asians are so happy. They approve. So I write about Gangnam Style in the anthology, and to me, besides making my 13-year-old self so happy this performance, what I think is really interesting about K-pop, right, is that all these videos are really texts of empire, right? That when we take a deep dive into these music videos, it is, you know, your mind is blown from the colors and the dancing and the music, yes. But what we can really see is the ways in which U.S. empire and occupation in South Korea, right, inflect everything, right, that K-pop produces. So Psy actually says about this performance that it's a great moment for him because he's been doing MC Hammer's moves since he was a kid, right? And that's because he was also inculcated in the language, the music, the dance of U.S. empire. So he himself sees this as like one of the sort of peak moments of his career. And so I think it's interesting, you know, Psy's heyday, there were a lot of popular presses that were like, why do Americans like K-pop? It's so foreign. But I think the whole point of this performance is to show that it's not foreign at all, right? That when it comes to pop, hip-hop, R&B, K-pop is very much like layers of American pop, hip-hop, and R&B. And sometimes that gets sort of framed as a copy, right? But I think it's actually much more than that. You know, and we could talk forever about hybrid and the ways in which Korean music is inflected and vice versa. But, you know, I think it's important to be able to see that historical relationship and unevenness of power, even in these musical and fun texts. I think the other side to that is that South Korea now uses K-pop as its own sort of empire-building project, right? So my analysis doesn't stop there, and I think that's the important part of this whole project and the book. You know, but this might be a good moment to show the next video.
날 위해서라면 난 슬퍼도 기쁜 척할 수가 있었어. 널 위해서라면 난 아파도 강한 척할 수가 있었어. 사랑이 사랑만은 완벽하게 내 모든 열정들은 다 숨겨지길 이루어지지 않는 꿈 속에서 피울 수 없는 꽃을 키웠어. I'm so sick of this fake love, fake love, fake love. I'm so sorry but it's fake love, fake love, fake love. I wanna be a gold just for you. 세상을 줘는 just for you. 전부 바꿔서 just for you. 나를 너무 for you. Hey, 우리만의 수 너는 없어. 내가 완전 blue 잊어버렸어. 나도 내가 누구였는지도 잘 모르게 돼. 거울에다 뒤걸려봐. 너는 대체 누구래? 위해서라면 난 숨고도 기쁜 척할 수가 있었어. 널 위해서라면 난 아파도 강한 척할 수가 있었어. 사랑이 사랑만은 너무 완벽하게 내 모든 이점들은 다 숨겨지게 이루어지지 않는 꿈속에서 피울 수 없는.
They're so cute. And literally that was the point of showing that video. It could have been any of the videos. You know, last year BTS made like a 2-minute appearance on the Grammys, and it was the most tweeted about moment of the entire Grammys. Right, so there's this way in which now Korea obviously is exporting K-pop at this astronomical level and creating a national brand for itself, right? That's about selling products, as in, you know, any products, water filters, cosmetics, fashion, but also about, you know, creating brand loyalty to the nation of Korea. And it's working very well, you know, utilizing digital technologies, obviously. But to me, you know, and this will be my last point, there's a section of the book called The Queer Routes and Roots of Pop Culture, or Queering the Roots and Routes. And, you know, what is a highly normalizing force in Korea, right? You know, because K-pop is very mainstream in Korea. It's like Britney Spears, right? It's not anything radical per se. What is fascinating to me about Korean pop culture is that it travels around the world and it means something different to all the people that consume it in different places. So something that's highly normalizing in one place in its origin country can be something very subversive, and the sort of music of the marginalized somewhere else. You know, so how this video gets read in Korea is very different than how it gets read, even say in New York City, right? I just taught a class on K-pop, and many of my students are queer identifying, and they love, you know, they love BTS. And it doesn't matter to them, you know, what their proclaimed sexuality is, first of all, right? Like, these can be queer, lesbian students, and they're like, we love BTS. And I'm like, you know, they're straight guys. Yeah, we don't care. Right, it becomes malleable, right? Because it's sort of outside of what American pop culture is offering them. So it becomes something else that can become whatever they want it to become. And I recently spoke at KCON in Los Angeles, which, if you don't know, is like the Comic-Con of K-pop, right? It's at the LA Convention Center. There's like thousands of teenagers there. It was mind-blowing. The hormones were palpable. I mean, you could like cut it with a knife. But, you know, I will just end on this. It's like, it was amazing to me. Mostly black, brown youth, right? Like, these kids are not the most popular kids at school. You know what I mean? By the sort of mainstream American standards. But they were there, and they were creating their own community. They were creating their own meetings out of K-pop. And it was all around Korean popular culture. So to me, that is really a mind-blowing thing, that this cultural product can travel so far, have all of these intended uses, and then just spin into something totally different. You know, the Korean government is not like, well, I hope that LGBTQ plus communities are embracing our music. No, that's not the intention, right? But that is the reality, I think, to me, is what we can learn from and salvage from global pop cultural forms. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the workshop, and thank you to Linta. Linta was my first original Kumar. I'm Harold. As a Korean American, I can attest that many of us have Kumars. And so for me, this book is in many ways an expression of my love of my Kumars, or my South Asian brothers and sisters. Because from the beginning of my career, I've been in Asian American studies. And Asian American studies started out principally as very East Asian focused, and eventually it incorporated Filipino Americans, and eventually Southeast Asian Americans, and in the 90s, certainly South Asian Americans as well. And so part of my career has always been to try to look at that breadth of the diversity of Asian America. But more recently, to sort of narrow the gap between what is seen as Asia and what is seen as Asian America. And I thought no better topic to choose than the two areas that I've focused on, which is number one, food studies, number two, popular culture studies, and I see them sort of connected. I want to actually begin by showing you a video. Let's see, do I just press? Well, this is yours. We're going to skip over this. If you get a chance, watch this video on your own. All right, I'm going to move on. All right, so I was born in Korea in the 60s. I just turned 55 last month. And I left Korea when I was 8 years old in 1972. When I left Korea, I recall, I remember the music of that time. And this song I'm going to play for you was my mom's favorite song. I remember as a kid living in Hawaii where I grew up, and as she was doing like dishes or whatever, she would hum this song. And later on in life, when I grew up, I realized it was this song that she was humming. And this song is by what I would refer to as the Billie Holiday of Korea. Her name is Lee Mi-ja, and she is perhaps one of the most foremost trot singer of my mom's era. And so this is, well, I just play for you. Oh, I'm sorry. Could you turn sound up, please? Sound? So that song is called Dongbek Agashi. Dongbek is camellia, the flower. So it's flower, young woman. So if any of you know this era of Korean music, and if you know Japanese music of the same era, it sounds very similar to what Japanese music is called enka, because the two are related. In many ways, the Korean trot comes from the shortened form of foxtrot. And so this trot music genre is, well, to be frank, it's borrowed from the enka tradition of Japan. So when I left Korea at the age of 8, I guess I like to think that as a Korean, I sort of fell asleep into a deep coma. So at the moment that I fell asleep into a coma, this was playing in my head. And for 40 years, I didn't go back to Korea at all. I had no Korean friends, virtually. The Korean friends I had were Korean Americans like me. And so for 40 years, I felt like I'd been in a coma as a Korean. And then one day, I wake up from this coma to this.
어디까지 왔나 너 어디서 만나 맘이 들어왔나 어디서 오셨나요 자꾸 눈을 감아요 그대 눈빛이 참 맘에 드네요 옆으로 가고 싶지만 용기가 안 나서 가슴이 떨려와 몰라 어떻게 난 몰라 미치겠어 널 놓치기 싫어 너에게로 점점 다가갈래 점점 내 옆에서 떠날 수 없게 Lollipop, lollipop, 이런 내도 난 다시 내게로 다가가 Lollipop, lollipop, 안 보일 거야 너에게 나를 보여줄 거야
Okay, so that's Tiara. I believe this song Roly Poly came out around 2012 or so. So I guess the question that I have for myself was when I woke up is what happened? How did it go from Imija to Tiara in my lifetime? And so when I woke up, I wanted desperately to sort of catch up on what I missed out. Of course, during the 40 years that I was in the United States, I consumed principally American popular culture. But somehow, when I was in my 40s, I had this weird aching to try to recoup what I didn't have a chance to live through. And so for the past, 8 years, I've been consuming Korean culture at a pace that would like make people's heads spin. So in real ways, although I'm in a 55-year-old man's body, as a Korean, I'm like a teenager, right? Because all my references to Korea is the age of K-pop, what I like to refer to as. Now I go back to Korea every year. I did a Fulbright in Korea, taught there for half a year, in English, of course. My Korean's gotten a lot better. I only sing Korean songs in like karaoke. I have like 50 songs that I memorized. So when I'm in Korea and I am hanging out with like professors who are my age, we have nothing to talk about. In fact, one of them teased me and said, "You know what, Robert? You should hang out with my kids. You have more in common with them." Because it's true. Because I want to talk about Tiara. I want to talk about Big Bang. I want to talk about what's happening, right? So for me, this book was an attempt to not only sort of be one with my Kumars, but also for myself try to reclaim what I felt I lost as a Korean American cut off from Korea. Now, of course, Korea is all over the United States. It's hard to miss Korea. We just walked past Paris Baguette on the way here, and which indicates, right, that it's quite an amazing place we live in right now. I want to share you one more song, which is currently my favorite K-pop group. This is Red Velvet. And my favorite song, Really Bad Boy. Not Bad Boy, Really Bad Boy.
머릿속 어떤 녀석 그 생각하나뿐이야. One, 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 one.
what's up there? So I remember back in like 2012 or so when I first started to research about K-pop, and I read a lot of American media, American music critics, magazines write about K-pop. It was all like just negative commentary. How the music was derivative, how the K-pop stars were all these cutout like robots, how this whole thing about the slave contracts of the idol trainees. It was one bad sort of story after another, and also, but principally of the music being so awful, so like mind-numbing, so well, like trashy, right? Well, and also back in about around that time, I remember reading many accounts of people saying there's no way that K-pop will ever make it in America. Right? You can go back and almost every critic would say that about K-pop. Well, they're all wrong, obviously, right? Because now you have a time such that American artists are copycatting K-pop. So the idea of the original and copy becomes very complicated, I think, if you look deep into it. So these are some of the concerns that brought me to the subject and for me to work on this book with Heijin and Monika. I wish she was here. But I don't want to take up all this time just with us. I know, I'm sure you in the audience maybe have some comments or thoughts or questions. And maybe for the time we have left, we can do a conversation. Yeah?
Now I'm the moderator. Yeah, so we're just going to open it up to comments or questions. Your favorite K-pop songs, I don't know. My fellow Malayali, go for it.
Hi, thank you so much for coming, and I'm really excited to get your book. I was just wondering, Linta, you mentioned in the book that like people would never kind of put these two different pop cultures together, and the book does like address in the ways in which they speak to each other. So I was just wondering if you could both elaborate a bit more on that, because I consume both, but like very discreetly, like never ever, like not even within the same day, maybe, like I would never do that. And maybe also speak to maybe any potential you see for crossovers, like when will we see like an Indian version of Boys Over Flowers or a Korean Dev Das, like, there's I think, what?
Yeah, I can start with that. Actually, one of the chapters in the book is by Jane Park. She's a professor in Australia. And she writes about 3 different remakes of a single film. My Sassy Girl in Korean was remade in India and remade in Hollywood. So she writes about the 3. And also the chapter that Monika wrote that Linta referred to talks about the tradition of hand-painted movie posters. I guess aside from that, there's not that many chapters that look at the two as if they are fused.
Well, there was that one about cinetourism, right? And
Right,
Shah Rukh
right.
Khan as like an ambassador.
What,
And
is your mic on?
yeah, there was an article about cinetourism, right? And Shah Rukh Khan is like an ambassador and all this, yeah. I didn't read it yet, though. So.
Yeah, so I think that there are those few chapters that address both, which, is really amazing scholarship because, again, there is nothing that speaks to these two cultural forms together. But I think the rest of the book is really interesting insofar as the way that we've grouped the essays and place them side by side, some of the really fascinating things that we see is, again, what is the need for these global pop cultural forms, right? When we have Hollywood, when we have American pop culture, and it turns out, right, there's a lot of need for it. And so the sort of gaps that both of these global formations are filling in, right, those spaces become the really interesting points of the book and points of comparison. So again, I think, Linta mentioned the dance classes, right, and how they become the sort of like diasporic art form, and sort of legitimized diasporic culture, and sort of putting that side by side with fan club, what do you call it, flash mob performances of K-pop songs in Mexico City, right? And so it's this fascinating way in which we get to see what these cultural forms mean globally in different places, and how they're really doing the work to fill in the gaps that hegemonic culture, the spaces where it is, sort of lacking for either diasporic groups or marginalized groups.
Yeah, and can I, and maybe you guys, probably since you've edited and had to read, can speak to this more, but the other editor, Monika Mehta, she writes about, I thought it was so, it was just fascinating, and it's more about kind of the affect of consuming this, where she wrote in her kind of personal narrative about watching K-dramas, but then reading the English translations and be like, oh my God, they're so stilted and like this makes no sense. But then translating the English into Hindi Urdu and be like, oh, now it makes sense, because it's like the same, kind of affect and historical dramas and all this stuff. So I was like, oh, she should have written about that as an article. But I thought that was such an interesting point, where like mediated through English, it seems so unlike each other, the two forms, but without that kind of middle language, I guess, I don't know, right? Like you start to see similarities.
Yeah, and I guess another issue that I think can come from this in terms of the looking ahead is Korea and India as competitors for a similar market, especially in Southeast Asia. In places like Malaysia, Singapore, I think both K-pop, Korean dramas, and Bollywood products are trying to compete for the same audience. And Hollywood, in this sense, is sort of, I think, pushed to the side, which is part of the point of the book, is that Hollywood is not the only player in the game anymore, if they ever was to begin with. In fact, now the pop empires, there are many. I would say, if you look at Egypt or Lebanon or Turkey or Mexico, you have so many different places where pop culture has this soft power hegemonic force, yeah? And so this is just one example of looking at Korea and India together, but I think we can look at many different combinations as well.
Hi, really excited to read the book. I'm also like a big consumer of both like Bollywood and K-pop. So one of the things that I was thinking about, Heijin, when you mentioned about how pop culture is like the pleasurable is political, in both India and Korea, I think one of the big things that plays into culture being politicized is religion. And I see that personally a lot in Bollywood with the way religion is portrayed and received by whoever's in power politically at the time. So I was wondering if that's something you all have explored, either like, even if not in the book, but just generally in your study of pop culture in Korea and India, like comparatively, like the role that religion can play in the way culture is like received and politicized.
That's a hard one.
I don't have a, I cut my intro short because it was way too long in many respects. But I actually realized that I had cut out a major point I wanted to make, which is that after India repealed Article 370, right, and just kind of intensified the colonial occupation of Kashmir, within 2 days there were 50 movie titles registered by Bollywood filmmakers that were like, you know, Article 370, Free Kashmir, like all of this really nationalist rhetoric and narrative. And I mean, I think that it's not about religion, but I think the question about the way that these forms also do play to certain, you know, like really hegemonic nationalist sentiments, which I think, Heijin, you kind of talked about, right? Just their circulation and in general, kind of sponsored by the state, fits in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of any examples of religion sort of specifically. But, you know, something that we write about in the book is the ways in which when current President Moon Jae-in was doing debates, there was some moment where he, you know, was like, I am against, you know, gay marriage, right? And this was a kind of official statement. And, you know, that to me is so ironic, again, when we think about the ways in which K-pop circulates. And one of the essays in the book by Dredge Kang, you know, talks about how in Thailand specifically, K-pop has enabled all these new gendered subjectivities and sexualities, right? So because queer men and women and non-conforming people are all styling themselves in similar ways after their favorite K-pop stars, right? It literally enables new pairings, right? It's sort of different people getting together that never got together before, new ways of reading bodies, right? What is your sexuality, right? This question becomes both murkier and sort of like more open. And so it's just this ironic moment to me where the Korean government is again sort of pronouncing that it's, you know, for all intents and purposes, anti-LGBTQ plus, and then here is their number one export becoming like, you know, basically the queer anthem of Thailand and Mexico and LA and New York and everywhere else, right? And so, again, I think that that irony about what the state intends and then what, you know, music or popular culture allows is a really interesting and fascinating journey.
Yeah, I guess indirectly to answer your question, I know that in Korea currently, Islam is making a really major presence. I was just there last month, and tourists from Muslim countries, workers from Muslim countries, by the thousands are currently hanging out in Korea. I was also for a little bit in Jeju Island to visit a restaurant called Warda, which means flower in Arabic, because last year there was a crisis in Korea where about 400 to 500 Yemenis escaping the war in Yemen through Malaysia came to Jeju Island, which is a sort of a, I don't know if you know Jeju Island. It's kind of a resort island in the south of Korea. They came there because there was no visa policy for tourists, and they found themselves there and applied for asylum. What that did was create all this panic among Koreans, and thousands of Koreans went on the streets to protest, and people were saying things like these Yemenis were terrorists, they were rapists, they were taking your jobs, and so forth. But during this time, a young Korean woman, a school teacher and a dancer artist, wanted to help the Yemeni refugees, and so she sought out the people who were working to assist the refugees in Yemen, from Yemen, and she lent them her small dance studio because many of them had no shelter. So over the course of a few months, over 100 Yemenis took advantage of her studio. Eventually, she opened a restaurant with a young Yemeni man who she eventually married. And so the Yemenis called her Warda, which means flower, because they were so grateful to her. So I went to Jeju last month to visit the restaurant and meet this couple. And what I've discovered is that in Jeju itself, there are about 20,000 Muslims who are living there, working in fisheries and farms. But there are hardly any halal restaurants or halal foods available. And so this Warda restaurant was one of the few that was providing this service, or this food. So just to make a long story short, Korea is undergoing this kind of change, right? This is the future of Korea. As this was the future of the US becoming more, look at this room, it's so diverse. Korea too is becoming diverse, and I think religion, especially Islam, is going to be a very important element of Korea. I can't speak for India's side, but I think in some sense, to me, that's, when you talk about religion in Korea, that came to mind immediately.
Hello. So for me as well, I consume Bollywood and K-pop way much more than I should be on a daily basis. But
You guys are our target audience right here.
so in my mind, to go off what she was saying, how for you kind of separate them in your mind. For me, it was always something that was very similar. The ways that both of these kind of industries work in my head have always been very similar in a way that music videos are very high production, they're very visual. In Bollywood, actors, actresses, musicians, they're all seen as idol status in the same way K-pop idols are. Everyone knows kind of the iconic dance moves in Bollywood. Like, everyone knows their Shava Shava dance, and in K-pop, we all know, like, Fancy by Twice. We all know the iconic moves that are all there. So in my head, because I consume both, and I come from a very Bollywood-loving family. Our parents grew up on Bollywood. My dad lived in India, went to med school in India. So he always told us stories as kids about how he would go to the movies on the weekends, and you can name a Bollywood movie and he'll know exactly what year it is, who was in it, things like. So we grew up on this type of pop culture being a part of our history. So I guess for me, it was almost very natural that I fell into this K-pop type industry, and it's something that really appealed to me. So I guess for me, as like separate questions, how did you kind of see the spark and the similarities between what you knew as Bollywood into K-pop, and for you, how did you see K-pop and what you knew growing up as similar to Bollywood? What was kind of that one thing, that the first thing that you saw that made you want to explore it more?
Oh, I was going to say this Kumar is just a filler. So I don't really study either. As a fan, I'm always amazed. Like I also teach college, and when I do teach about K-pop, I started teaching about K-pop because, I was like, all right, like these students don't want to learn about, like, how much can I talk about like labor and finance and kind of how we need to, like break down like national sentiment, all this stuff. So then I'll be like, oh, we're going to also look at K-pop. And then I remember, so I don't know much about it, so I always ask them, because I always have students. And they're usually like, I teach at a majority Black and Latinx institution, and it's usually like Black and Latinx students who, will raise their hand and tell me. And we have a small international Korean student body, but they obviously have a very different relationship to it. And I remember like when the first videos I watched, it was like the dancing really, kind of like you were saying, like that form, kind of like the aesthetic bodily form, like not just choreographed, but so synchronized, right? Like that's what I always think about Bollywood dancing. It's that at some point, not in the 70s and 80s so much, but like when production value got better, like just the way that the background dancers, like everything is just so highly synchronized, and I kind of see that kind of functioning in K-pop too. And everyone's so pretty, like in Bollywood too.
You just basically articulated my whole pedagogical strategy, right? Let's watch K-pop. Now let's talk about colonialism. Let's watch K-pop. Now let's talk about global capitalism. No, I think that what's interesting about both, and the anecdote that you shared about Monika, that she writes about in the book, so please buy the book and then you can read her anecdote. There's something about Korean dramas, for example, right? They're so emotional, they're so dramatic, right? My cousin turns out to be my lover, except we didn't know because I got hit by a car and then I had amnesia and then we got separated and I saw them 9 years later. It's like this whole wild ride. And I think that there's something about both forms where if you're a recent immigrant or you lived there, you live through modern history in either of these places, it's kind of what life was like, right? When my parents, if you can get your parents or your grandparents to talk about their past, right? Korean War, industrialization, living through dictatorships, this is the same kind of stuff. And so I think there's like an affect, there's a sort of cinematic style, there's a pace to the drama that I think, people who connect with that, right, it makes sense. And it makes sense in a very different way than 10 seasons of The Office, right, where you're like watching people at work and it takes them 5 years to fall in love, right? It's like, and I love The Office. I'm not bagging on The Office, but I'm saying, right, it's a very different kind of art and pop culture and pleasure. And so I think, that's the kind of hook that when you can hook into that, it's, to me, is because it's actually something familial and cultural and historical that the people from Korea, from India, and these different places, like, we've lived through some crazy, fast, turbulent times, and our cultural forms reflect that, I think.
So far, only people in that little corner have asked questions. What about this side? Now I do feel like I'm in class. I'm like, how do you guys?
Robert mentioned something about K-pop being appropriated in the States, and I'm curious about that because I see K-pop as very appropriated culture, like how it was incorporating like Indian culture in and they consume it as like exotic, even like the historical group Chakra, and recently Red Velvet's Zimbalbim, that was like movement, and also in other groups I see appropriation from Black culture, American Black culture and African culture, and most of the time they're appropriating like U.S. pop culture, but then they're making their own now. But I'm curious to find out what do you mean by it's being appropriated by like other cultures?
Yeah, I think because K-pop is now such a global phenomena, American artists want in on it. So I think Missy Elliott started this a while ago, Halsey recently, and Cardi B, I think. All these contemporary, like U.S.-based or English Anglophone artists seems to be very interested in K-pop, not just BTS, now it's Blackpink and everyone else. So I just find it ironic that you have this inversion of a genre that was once seen as derivative, now being the object of being copied, or people who might have once upon a time said, hey, the reason why, of course, is because Korea has been colonized in some sense by the U.S. for so many years, and how could the Koreans not absorb all this American music? As early as 1950s, all American musical forms, even Afro music forms, were coming to Korea via the U.S. military and so forth. And you had Korean performers doing this kind of music for a very long time. And so K-pop is just, I think, the more recent manifestation of this. But things have changed, I guess, for me, in my perception, in that now, if you look at the top American artists, they are now sort of seeing the kind of choreography, kind of musical forms that come out of Seoul. And I think now it's a kind of exchange more so than ever before. The video of Psy and Hammer is fascinating to me. I just wanted to make a comment about that because I remember when Psy became really famous, when it first became really a big hit, there's a lot of people who thought he was only famous because he maybe embodied a certain kind of male Asian stereotype, right? If you recall William Hung from American Idol, there was for a while a lot of Asian Americans who were kind of embarrassed about Psy, that he was seen as, once again, he is famous and he's making it big because he fulfills a certain American racist ideas about Asian men. But when you look at that video, you realize he doesn't, maybe more so than a stereotype of Asian man, he's very much black. He's not, right? He's not Asian. That K-pop from the very beginning was made up of all of these different things. And now I think that it's gotten so big, we can sort of see it better. And it's not just imitation, but it's on its own, it evolved in so many ways. It's now its own thing, perhaps. I don't think I'm answering your question because it's a hard one, but
I mean, there's so much to say on this topic, but one thing I was struck by what you just said, Robert, was the video that you showed, the second one. I don't know it, but what I was struck by is this the sort of hip hop affect, right? You don't have to know the language to recognize the movements, right? The ways in which masculinity is inflected, and and the poses, and the way that the beats are in the rap, and so it's interesting, right? We're always trying to sort of think about what is American and what is not, and what is Korean or what is South Asian, but there's a way in which that some of these forms are global now, right? And have their own sort of global lives and consumptions. And yet we always have to trace them back to the communities where they originated. And I think this is where it becomes really tricky, where, for instance, rap and hip hop become a part of the American sort of globalizing hegemonic project, right? Which is obviously not the intention of black hip hop artists per se, but becomes the effect of it, right? And so we see all of these artists in other countries, taking on this global style. Is it appropriation or is it not? And then you get into like every specific case. But I think, there is the ways in which U.S. culture, there's 1,000 U.S. military bases around the world, right? All of these bases require people performing, people, bringing American products, American food, American culture to all of these places. And it's been this way for all of, modern history. So I think that, how these cultural forms travel and get taken on is a really, really sort of messy question.
Yeah, I think maybe like one more question, or yeah? I mean, if there is one. I saw someone, okay, I was like, I don't know if that was a head scratch or a question. Yeah, go for it.
Hi, I'm skeptical of all forms of imperialism. So I'm curious in terms of, I think the broader conversation so far have been about, how the liberating aspects of K-pop and how that has helped, a lot of LGBTQ identifying people, I think, find liberation. But I'm curious more about the more pernicious effects. So I'll give you, I guess, a little bit of background. I've been in the Philippines for the past 2 summers, and I think K-pop has experienced massive uptake there. But alongside that, a lot of the whitening beauty creams and sort of stuff like that has been there before K-pop, to be clear. But now has, I think, been magnified a bit more now that it's gained such a hegemonic following. has only been accelerated. So I'm curious as to what sort of more pernicious impacts of this pop empire that you've identified, specific both to, I guess, Bollywood and K-pop.
Oh, they're looking at me. Yeah, I mean, I think, if I had to imagine an article, an essay in this book, I would talk a lot about language. And I noticed things like, Robert revealed his age, so I'll reveal mine. I'm going to be 49 next week. So I think that what I have seen in Kerala is, this progression from Hindi and Bollywood being so foreign to the point when I was a teenager and I would visit, and I would wear salwar kameez, like the pants and the long shirt, or sometimes a short shirt, depending on the style. People would, like, I had my, people in my mom's small town be like, oh, she's North Indian. And it's like, I'm not. But they just really identified certain markers, regional markers, kind of like language, ethnic markers as foreign. And now what I see is my cousins like dropping Hindi words. And, I know Hindi because I had to, like I shared for my research. But I do think that, thinking about India as like a multilingual country and the way that Hindi and then flowing from that, the products that are Hindi based but really the language has been used to consolidate like very kind of right-wing nationalist identities. And right now there is on and off like a push to make Hindi like the language that everyone has to know. But almost, I think like 40% of India doesn't speak Hindi because that is not our language background. And there have been a long history of battles around language, and I have wondered how Bollywood now is unintentionally, right? Sometimes intentionally, depending on some really nationalist filmmakers I've been reading about, kind of how they are folded into this battle over what it means to be Indian, not just around religion, but about language, around region, this idea that sometimes people in the South, like that we're like a different race of people, right? That we have like a different kind of genetic stock. And Bollywood does engage with that in ways that I find troubling sometimes. And in the diaspora.
Thank you. I really appreciate that question. It was actually sort of what I was trying to get at in some of my introduction, right? That we can't sort of stop our analysis at U.S. occupation of South Korea and that's it, right? Because South Korea itself has a very nationalist, triumphant narrative around K-pop. It's like, wow, look how much the world is accepting our culture. But this is very intentional, right? It's not just about selling music. It's again about building soft power in many, many different places, right? And this is evidenced by cultural centers being built in places like Mexico, Ethiopia, right? You name it. The Korean government has a cultural center and a way for, people in these far-flung, places to become sort of indoctrinated and inculcated in Korean culture. And it's very intentional, both, in terms of setting pathways to product consumption, right? Like if you might like K-pop now, and then hopefully in 10 years you'll keep buying Samsung products, right? But also consolidating its political power, particularly, within Asia. My main research is actually on beauty, so I'll just, end with the kind of obvious ways in which beauty tells us this story. As you mentioned, the whitening creams. I started this research because so much of the narrative around Korean consumption of plastic surgery, for instance, was around Koreans want to look like white people. And I had never actually heard a Korean person ever say, I want to look like a white person. So, it's a very simple inquiry, like, what is this discrepancy? And what's interesting to me in the years that I've done this research now, right, Korea has a medical tourism industry and, its main market is cosmetic surgery. Chinese, Japanese, Singaporean, Southeast Asian medical tourists come because they don't want to look like white people. They want to look like Korean people. Right? And, even if you can't travel, for instance, in Vietnam, they have plastic surgeons that advertise and say, we do Korean plastic surgery, Right, so what does that mean, right? It means that the Korean body is sort of standing in for what the white body used to stand in for, which is a sort of capitalist modernity and a cosmopolitanism, right? That if you look a certain way, you can live a certain lifestyle. And Korea right now is that's what Korea signifies. And again, it's through the pleasurable that these symbols sort of take shape, right? It's like, oh, I want to live like that. I want to live like that drama. I want to live like that, K-pop star. And so again, when we talk about the pleasurable being very political, I think your question gets to the heart of it. There's ways in which we really enjoy it, and there's ways in which that it's really inculcating us with, geopolitical power, right? In all of our desires, aspirations, and consumer choices.
Yeah, and I think Korea has learned quite a bit from the United States in that the U.S. spent most of the 20th century spreading not only its hard culture, not only using military might to conquer, but also soft power to spread American culture. And in the 21st century so far, Korea, I think, is following that footstep. And places like the Philippines and Vietnam and poor parts of, say, China, Southeast Asia writ large, is the target for Korean soft power. And one of the reasons is because Korea itself now needs labor. There are jobs in Korea that Koreans don't want to do. So they're bringing in labor from Vietnam and from the Philippines and places like that. But how do you coax those people to come to Korea? Well, the process that Heijin just talked about, K-pop and Korean dramas become a kind of advertising for the Korean dream. Not the American dream, but the Korean dream. 2 books came out this past 3 years, which talks about the migration of Filipinas to Korea to marry Korean men who live in farms, because all the Korean women are going to the cities. So now you have, in many parts of Korea, rural Korea, these multicultural families, multiracial families or multinational families, where the men are these older Korean men and the wives are young Filipinas or Vietnamese or Chinese. And that's the new Korea, right? So I think you're absolutely right. I think it's imperative that we look at not only the pleasurable aspect of K-pop and Bollywood, but also this more sinister side of it that's part of, all capitalist consumption and motor production. So thank you.
So I think we'll end on that uplifting note. There are books, so now are the books available? Or they will be, yeah. And there's wine. I still see some bottles full of wine and water. Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you.